Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. I'm doing something a little bit different with the camera today. I've been trying to make it smaller and get myself sort of out of the way of the video some. I need you guys to let me know if you like this one better or if you want me to go back to the other. Today we're going to do Cliffs of Gallipoli Part 1, the Sabaton history portion of the Sabaton song Cliffs of Gallipoli. Let's get into it.
I'm Indy Nidell.
And I'm Joachim from Sabaton.
And this is Sabaton History. Now, this song is going to be covered in 2 episodes, so I can cover 2 aspects of the topic. Gallipoli. For 8 months in 1915, that name was headline news worldwide.
And our song, Cliffs of Gallipoli, is a tribute to the men who fought and died there.
The Great War was just a half-year old, but casualties had already risen to unthinkable levels. British soldiers were dying by the tens of thousands in the bloody stalemate on the Western Front. And leading politicians began looking for an alternative to the slaughter in the trenches. Most vocal among them were Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, who thought that instead of trying to beat the Germans in Flanders, they should strike towards the weakest link of the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire. They believed the Ottoman military to be second-rate, more of a nuisance than an equal. Churchill envisioned a strike against Constantinople itself by sea. Taking the Turkish capital would drive the Ottomans out of the war and open up a direct shipping route towards Britain's Russian ally.
That is the big part of this, right? Opening up the shipping lanes to Russia is a huge part of this plan. Why it's considered. Kitchener was seen as the guy who was kind of looking out for the soldiers during this conflict, at least until, he died. Churchill gets this gets kind of wrapped around his neck, this whole idea of going to Gallipoli. I actually kind of think it was a good idea that was extremely poorly executed. I'll get more into why I think that in just a little bit.
Directly, it would safeguard British interests in Mesopotamia and Suez as well. So on paper, this seemed like a total win-win for the Allies. A major reason for the British hubris was the recent military record of the Ottoman Empire. Serious defeats during the Balkan Wars and the recent catastrophic outcome of the Battle of Sarikamish just weeks ago, where tens of thousands of soldiers froze to death in the Caucasus Mountains, painted a picture of incompetent leaders and a badly equipped and trained Ottoman military. The sick man at the Bosporus would be no match for the professional British soldiers. There was, however, a major obstacle along the way. To strike against Constantinople, any Allied fleet would have to penetrate the straits of the Dardanelles that guard the entrance to the Sea of Marmara. And those straits were now...
Okay, so the Dardanelles have been a strategic choke point for ever. I mean, literally for forever. They're talked about during the Greco-Persian Wars, long before this time. It's just a very strategic area, and it's a way to get to a lot of the ports in Russia, right? The ports that you really need to get to during cold months are through the Black Sea, and you have to get through the Dardanelles to make that happen.
Narrow, and had been a natural line of defense for centuries.
Yes.
And the sick man was not as sick as the British believed. Since the Balkan Wars, the defenses of the straits had been continually improved and ammunition restocked. In addition to long-range guns, the Ottomans had mobile 120mm howitzer batteries on the ready, highly trained troops, and line after line of mines in the waters. Under Çanakkale Fortified Area Command of General Fahri Pasha, the Dardanelles became the most fortified area of the whole Ottoman Empire. The British and French fleets tried to force passage through the straits. Even a modern warship can be sunk by a single mine, though. And after disaster on March 18, 1915, when the Ottomans sank 3 Allied battleships and severely damaged 3 more, the Allies had to rethink.
Hear them whisper, voices from the other side. hear them calling, for my foes no friends are resting side by side.
Here's the thing though. The thought process initially was not to use modern battleships to force the straits, right? That was not the plan initially. Was that the British had all of these warships that were modern just 15 years before, that by this point had become all but obsolete. They were going to be scrapped at the end of the war. And so the idea was not to go put your brand new battleships in harm's way, taking hits by these mines. It was to use the ships that were going to be scrapped at the end of the war to force the straits, to hit the mines, just do everything you can to force through, to bludgeon through, and then you could actually take out the guns that are on land by sea once you force the straits. Now, getting back to the whole, idea and plan by Winston Churchill, I actually think this is somewhat of a good idea. Those ships are to be scrapped anyway. They really have no real use to the British at this point. They aren't capable of fighting another modern navy. Like, those ships can't go fight the German Navy right now, right? They're so technologically behind what the modern British and German ships are that they wouldn't survive in a battle with the German Navy at this point. So to use them to force the straits, because of how strategically important that is, I think that's actually a good idea. Once the British Admiralty decided that that was too high of a price to pay, though, I think the idea was dead. Once they decided that they were going to bring in Marines and they were going to have, landings on the beaches of Gallipoli, I think at that point, before a soldier ever touched ground in Gallipoli, I think the plan was already destroyed and it wasn't going to work, and I just feel like the only way this could have possibly worked is if you were willing to force the straits and lose some of those older ships. The plan as it ended up working out, I don't think it could have worked.
The artillery positions on the hills had to be taken out first by land if the operation towards Constantinople was to succeed. The task was given to General Sir Ian Hamilton, in overall command of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. The MEF included, along with British units, the ANZAC, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, under General Sir William Birdwood. ANZAC had been heading for Britain before being diverted to Egypt. Instead of fighting Germans, they would now fight the Ottomans. The Australians, New Zealanders, and Maoris of ANZAC considered themselves natural soldiers, men hardened by daily outdoor activity, and the aggressive and unruly character of the Anzacs seemed perfect for the task ahead. The MEF was further strengthened by an Indian brigade and the Gurkha Rifles, who joined the Anzacs and a French force at Malta in early March. The French government was not too keen on the whole endeavor, but they themselves had their own ambitions in the Middle East and could not simply leave it all to the British if they succeeded in toppling the Ottomans.
That's actually a big part of why this ends up happening the way that it does, and why the French are involved in the Middle East, during the war. It's because they're looking at the post-war future, and they want stuff in the Middle East. That's going to be a big part of the war later on.
The French created the 1st Division Corps Expeditionnaire d'Orient, made up of regular French troops, the French Foreign Legion, and Senegalese and Zouave forces. Once again, though, the planning phase betrayed the arrogance of British high command. While generals on the western or eastern fronts made plans for all sorts of eventualities and for a quick exit if everything suddenly went to hell, nothing of the sort was prepared for the Gallipoli landings. Instead, Hamilton's plan was overambitious, and it had one critical flaw. It all depended on the Ottoman inability to stand up to the invaders.
And not only that, they had already tried to force the straits at this point. So they tried to force the straits, and then they failed, and they pulled their ships back because, like I said, that price was too high for the British Admiralty. They did not want to pay the price that Churchill wanted them to pay by giving up some of their, or a lot of their older ships. But then that gave a huge chunk of time for the Ottomans where they knew exactly where the British were coming. They knew exactly what was about to happen. And so everything that wasn't already prepared for a ground invasion got prepared immediately in that time period.
But what if they did not turn and run and instead stood and fought?
That horse was running with the beat.
The German influence over the Ottoman forces was personified by General Otto Liman von Sanders in command of the 5th Army at Gallipoli. Ever since the naval attacks, it was thought that an invasion might take place. And the British did little to hide their intentions. In fact, the Greek newspapers ran headlines about the coming landings.
Yep.
But the Gallipoli Peninsula was large, and the Ottoman forces could not guard every beach. Von Sanders decided to put only a screening force as a tripwire defense close to the beaches and keep most of his men in reserve units further back. Ottoman officers at the front would assess the situation and send in reinforcements where necessary. One such officer was Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal, in command of the Ottoman 19th Division. He was familiar with the defenses, and his troops were well-trained, motivated, and equipped. In fact, with the help of German instructors and weapon supplies, it was quite a formidable fighting force.
And that's a big part of this too. The Germans are helping quite a bit in training and in leadership for these Ottoman forces for Gallipoli.
The landings began the night of April 25th. The Anzacs would land on the west of the peninsula at a place called Gabatepe, later known as Anzac Cove. They would build a bridgehead and advance the next day all the way to the heights of Maltepe. The other British troops would land at the tip of the peninsula, Cape Helles, and then take Achibaba and the Kilid Bar Plateau in one fell swoop. After that, they would simply join forces and push the Ottomans from the heights. There were also several diversionary landings around the flanks, with the French landing on the Asian side of the straits at Comcale. Illuminated by the moon, the Anzac landing craft made their way towards their destination, fighting the strong currents. The beaches were in darkness and all was still, and hopes were high that they would fully surprise the enemy. But
again, the idea is that they're going to fully surprise an enemy who has known they were coming for 2 months by this point. I mean, not quite 2 months, but for all intents and purposes, 2 months they have known that they're coming. And the thought process still is that they believe they're going to catch them by surprise. Brutal.
as soon as they made ground, the first bullets crashed into the boats. A concert of rapid rifle fire erupted, and the battle for Gallipoli had begun. Anzac was not even facing an entire battalion, but the sudden fire caused confusion as the first casualties began to litter the beaches. As more and more Anzacs landed, the outnumbered Ottomans retreated to higher ground and into prepared trenches. And as the sun rose, they fired freely into the mass of men on the beaches. The Anzacs had been ordered not to load their rifles and instead rushed up the hill, bayonets fixed. But in the dim morning, it was hard to navigate the steep heights and the thorny undergrowth, and the Ottomans fired and retreated further. The Anzacs were soon left out in the open, trying to make sense of the rough terrain, climbing the high ridges, running through razor-sharp thorns and over slippery stones, soon left the men exhausted, and many fell to accurate Ottoman sniper fire. The maps were totally inadequate, and the officers still standing were overwhelmed by the situation. The Ottomans themselves retreated towards the heights of Chunuk Bair. From the high ground, they could direct artillery fire onto the beaches. Mustafa Kemal was among the first to understand that the landings at Anzac Cove were not a diversion, but were the real deal. He ordered his division to Sari Bair, the highest point on the peninsula. But while he himself was trying to get a better view of the situation, he saw exhausted men flooding back from the fighting. Upon ordering them to stop, They declared that the Anzacs were moving up and they themselves had no ammunition left. While Kemal's orderlies were running back to get the division moving, he ordered the men he'd halted to fix their bayonets and turn back to attack with the now famous words, "I don't order you to attack, I order you to die. In the time which passes until we die, other troops and commanders can take our place."
That is one of the most famous quotes of the war. It is wild, the thought process of the Ottomans on the beach. Because think about it, the British are expecting that not only are they going to catch them by surprise, but that they're not going to want to fight, right? That they're going to turn and run as soon as the landing force gets there. That is the thought process of the Ottomans. I do not order you to fight, I order you to die. So the British are expecting no resistance, and that is the type of resistance they are going to get.
Hell is waiting where the ocean meets the sand, cliffs of burden, where the soldiers rushed into today.
The pursuing Anzacs were totally caught off guard by the sudden counterattack. Fearing that Ottoman reserves had already arrived, they pulled back. Everywhere around Anzac Cove, the Ottoman resistance began to stiffen. Attempts to cross the ridges were immediately met with heavy fire from an unseen enemy. The invaders were stuck. At Helles, the situation was even worse. Way worse. This was an obvious landing site, and the Ottoman defenders had prepared thoroughly. As the Allied landing craft closed in on the beaches, they were met with a deadly hail of bullets. Many men were hit before they could make landing. Others panicked and jumped into the water. Many of those drowned, dragged down by their heavy kit. But those that made it out of the boats met belts of barbed wire guarding the beach, trapping them in the open. Soon, bodies littered the beach, and the waves washed ashore blood red. The men lucky enough to make it through huddled down behind a sandbank. At just 5 feet high, around 1.5 meters, it was the only cover available. Again, there were only a few Ottoman platoons defending the area, but they had fortified trenches and knew how to use their rifles and field artillery to deadly effect. The British officers could only watch as the landing crafts were blown to pieces. The men at Helles were trapped. Similar scenes happened at the other landing places. Y Beach was shot to pieces, while the attacks on X and S broke down the same way as the main landings without major results. Often forgotten by the history books is the French landing at Kum Kale, the only semi-victory that day. That force, under General Albert d'Amada, was to silence the Ottoman guns on the Asian side of the straits and divert Ottoman troops. Their actual landing was nearly unopposed, but the overall Ottoman forces facing them were far more numerous than on the European side. Fighting for the tiny town lasted all day, but the vicious close-quarter combat was for naught. The invasion plan had failed. And as darkness fell, it came as a relief. For the exhausted Ottomans, it was time to fall back and reorganize and wait for the reserves. For the Allies, the cover of night was a saving grace. Finally, they could make a move. Men could come ashore, the injured could be tended to, and fresh officers could take charge. The wounded flooded back to the medical ships. But the doctors and nurses were not prepared for the amount of casualties. There was not enough room. There was not enough morphine. And even if a wounded man survived, it was still a journey of 600 miles, 1,000 kilometers, back to Alexandria to recuperate. And so the first day of Gallipoli came to an end. But the campaign had only just begun.
How many wasted lives? How many dreams they fade away? Broken promises, they won't be coming home.
So, Joachim, tell us a little bit about the musical side of Cliffs of Gallipoli. Well, that's a good question, Joachim, because it's actually a song that took a long time to write. I started writing it in 2006.
I feel like all of these songs would take a long time to write. Like I said, the ideas are just so out of the box that I feel like they would all be super hard and complicated to get down on paper.
And it's actually one of those projects. Sometimes you start writing a song and it takes a while before you get it done or finish it. But in many cases, it's been lying dormant. You haven't been working actively on it. In the case here, though, I think I constantly wrote on that song almost every day for 2 years.
Like, okay, so the finished released version, does it sound very different from when it came out?
Oh, yes and no. I mean, I don't know how many songs. I mean, all the parts that were taken away for that song probably could consist of 2 more songs in it. You know?
Wow.
Same thing for Bismarck, actually. It's probably 3 songs worth of writing in there. It didn't take as long, though. But with Cliffs of Gallipoli, I just felt that I had something special going on. And it's not a typical Sabaton song at all. Well, you know, you get these, you fall in love with some of your projects a little bit more.
Right.
And sometimes a little bit too much. This is
Okay.
one of those cases. I really felt it was something I wanted to make perfect, as good as I could. And for once, I actually think I couldn't have done it any better. Probably someone else could, but at least
your
I
song.
couldn't. And it's one of the few times where a guitar solo I wrote ended up on the album.
Aha. Now, did you write the music and the words, or did you just write the music and the words?
The lyrics was written with me and Per together.
Okay.
Yes, really one of the most fantastic stories. And you know, in most cases, we actually get to visit the sites we sing about
Right.
after we've done the song.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And in this case,
God, that would be so awesome to get to go to the places that you talk about historically, to go to Gallipoli or to go to, you know, France and see World War I battlefields, or, you know, just all that stuff would be so, so awesome.
when we came to Gallipoli the first time, that is spooky because
Yeah.
it's like paradise.
Yeah.
It's so beautiful there. And then you think, you know, you're walking around, what the, you know, where are the trenches? And then you almost fall and break your leg. It's like, okay, I guess there are the trenches.
Well, that's such a different contrast in the same war. Like, you know, we've talked about and we've visited together like locations on the Western Front at Verdun and stuff, and it is really somber. And it is, and you feel that there's been.
I would literally give anything. My parents got to go to France 2 years ago. I would give anything to go see the battlefield of Verdun. It is at the very, very top of my bucket list. Jesus, what I would not give to go see Verdun.
War here, but when you're like overlooking the Dardanelles and stuff, I mean, it's just fantastically beautiful. You don't think, I mean, there are, sure, there's earthworks and that they've rebuilt, and there's some physical buildings and defenses, but you don't see it unless you're thinking of it, that this was a place where thousands upon thousands of people died in horrible conditions.
No, I mean, and I also think that I would have done things differently. I mean,
Yeah.
if me and Per had been there and seen that, we would have built in some parallels of, you know, the contrast of then and now in a way.
Oh, that'd be very interesting too. Well, maybe you could write another song about Gallipoli.
Yeah, I mean, this one gets 2 episodes, so maybe we should cover it again.
And
What do you think?
you've got all that extra music that didn't make the final. So you've got.
That is actually a really brilliant
So-
idea.
So you've made Cliffs of Gallipoli. This could be like the bays of Gallipoli, or the sea of Gallipoli, or the Dardanelles.
The shores of Gallipoli.
Shores of Gallipoli. I see.
Ah.
All right. So on your second album, Great War Part 2, that's going to come out. Your 90s R&B album that comes out in 2020.
Yes.
That's going to have Shores of Gallipoli on it.
Yes, a trap beat. Cool, man.
All right. Well, I think we've all learned something today.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Joachim.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you next time.
Oh, mothers, wipe your tears. Your sons will rest a million years. Found their peace at last, as foe turned to friend. And forget that they knew they would die. Gallipoli.
All right, and here's some cool stuff going. We're gonna do our older albums with the History Channel editions. That's got indie speaking. It's cool as I can't say that word. Anyway, you should become a Patreon because then you can get that stuff. See you soon.
Okay, so that was the Cliffs of Gallipoli Sabaton History Part 1. Again, y'all tell me what y'all think about the camera. If y'all want me to go back to the old one or keep this one. Like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. And I will see you all next time.